like the Pepsi logo versus the Coke logo. Actually, it's the other way around, the real experiment. Anyway, so you're making choices. I would throw the switch, I would not throw the switch. And they see what happens in your brain. Well, anyway, in this particular example, when you're making a decision about whether to throw the switch or not, kill 1 to save 5, most of the activity appears to be going on in the prefrontal cortex, sort of higher road neural processing of computing a decision. Whether you are going to shove the guy off the train and kill him, physically throw him, the area that lights up is sort of more of an amygdala, low-road, emotion-driven parts of the brain. In other words, it feels really bad about killing somebody directly, but calculating whether you throw a switch or not is more of a sort of cold, reason, rationality kind of switch. If my book were about politics, I'd be giving you other examples, but that book's already been done by a guy named Drew Weston called A Political Brain. I recommend the book. He's a political consultant, by the way, since we're in an election year. He's been doing a lot of consulting. He says the Democrats have made a huge mistake thinking that we can reason to voters to our position through that high road prefrontal cortex. No. Go for the amygdala. Go for the fear and danger and you need us because that's it. And there seems to be something to that sort of low road, high road approach. So what I'm arguing is that these are emotions that evolve to help us resolve conflicts and get along in a social environment. So instead of thinking of an economy as a market with money, think of an economy as any social environment in which organisms are doing any kind of interacting and exchanging. That's what an economy is. So think of 2 chimps sitting there grooming each other, picking fleas and ticks off each other. Well, we know that has some hygienic value, right? So pick off those nasty ticks and so on. Yes, it does that. But we also know already that it has other purposes. Being touched by somebody else does create sort of a relax, heart rate and blood pressure decreases and when you get a massage or when you're touched. And it also creates a sense of bonding and attachment. And we know that in addition to oxytocin's effect, the hormone oxytocin's effect on nursing mothers and attachment to their infants, anybody that's touched by anybody else gets a little spike in oxytocin. Couples that are in love have a lot of oxytocin going on. Doing what couples in love do. And even total strangers, when they are cooperating in an effective way, have a little increase in oxytocin. So we know there's something going on there hormonally. And but on one more level, when it's now been documented, when chimp A grooms chimp B, when chimp B gets attacked by the alpha male or some challenging male later, he's more likely to get a little support from the other chimp. In other words, it sets up kind of a political alliance. So it's hygienic, it's psychological, and it's also social or economic. So that's a form of exchange. It's reciprocal altruism. I'm scratching your back in this case pretty bitterly. And I'm going to get something in return for that. But of course, these chimps, and even you see this in other simpler small brain monkeys, they're not calculating anything. They don't even have a cortex to do the calculating like we do. They're just feeling it. It's just an unspoken emotion. So the value of emotions is important. So that's a big part of my book. That is, if we think of something simple like hunger or thirst, the emotion of thirst or hunger is there to motivate organisms to move and do something, to get water or get calories. So if we think of the body as a homeostatic system that's either in balance or out of balance, almost always out of balance, and constantly in drive to get closer to homeostasis. And emotion is just simply a brain mechanism sending signals to get up, move around, and do something. And then another brain signal that says, and we really like this stuff if you find any, and fat, sugar, and things like that. And so there's a whole sort of evolution of that. But so let's go one order higher, one step higher, say attractiveness to somebody else. We can certainly understand why sex is fun because it helps us propagate the species, and we're trying to get our genes into the next generation. Okay, good for the species. You can see why natural selection would select for that. But we now have a fairly extensive body of data from evolutionary psychologists in precisely what it is that other people find attractive in members of the opposite sex. And so women find in men attractive broad muscular shoulders, narrow waist, symmetrical face and body, clear complexion. These are all proxies for genetic health, right? And men find in women attractive, again, symmetrical bodies and faces, clear complexions, that hourglass figure, and that waist to hip ratio of 0.67. 0.67, waist to hip ratio. This is what the data says. And now nobody walks into a nightclub and goes, whoa, this is a 0.72, close enough. Doing some sort of calculating. This is not a prefrontal cortex thing. This is a lower road emotional, whoa, I have this feeling. It's an emotion. The emotion is a proxy for something else, a calculation already done by evolution for us. So what I'm arguing that is all emotions are like that. That sense of what's right and wrong in that particular trolley car experiment. And all these moral emotions are there for the same kind of reason, although maybe we think of them as a higher order emotion, for solving social conflicts and for getting along in a social primate species. Another one of these behavioral economic games is kind of a fun one. It's called the ultimatum game. So let's say you two are my students, and you're poor and starving, so you really need the money, and I got some cash, I'll give you $100. And you have the option of making him an offer of a split of the 100. You don't know each other. Last night I did this, it turned out they were married, they gave me the wrong answers because they had other things going on. Anyway, you might be married. Okay, so anyway, it's all right. Just pretend you don't know each other. And I give you $100, you offer whatever split you offer. If he accepts the offer, you won't get the money, and if not, if he says, I reject the offer, I'm going to take the money back, and neither of you gets any money. Okay? What should she offer you? Now, according to rational choice theory in economics, that is so-called homo economicus, where we are economic man, we are rationally calculating decision makers, free to make choices, and we maximize our utility or value of whatever it is we're freely choosing to get. That's the theory. It's a complete myth, completely debunked by behavioral economics. In fact, if she offers him a 90-10 split, according to homo economicus theory, rational choice theory, he should take the $10. Right? Poor starving student walks into my lab, got no money. 5 minutes later, he can walk out with $10, go buy himself 2, maybe even 3 venti lattes at Starbucks. But in fact, almost all subjects in that scenario reject a 90-10 offer. And nobody gets any money. In other words, he's willing to pay me $10 to punish her for her unfair offer. And they will say something like that, because it's not fair. Because I don't think he should get away with that. And things like that. Well, that's irrational. Unless you think of it in a larger context of evolutionary theory. That is, you can't let people get away with those sorts of defections on social contracts and unfair offers when we're redistributing food in an environment in which resources are fairly limited. We evolved in a zero-sum game where for most people, or most of these societies were egalitarian. There wasn't much stuff to go around, and therefore redistribution was fairly common, and there were all sorts of informal means of enforcing that. It doesn't get okay until she makes about a 70-30-64 split. Those are usually accepted. Okay, well, my friend Paul Zak has actually tested this now. He's an economist at Claremont Graduate University with this business of oxytocin. That is, subjects playing that ultimatum game. And there's variations on it. Maybe it's you two, and whatever offer you make her, she's just going to keep whatever. She doesn't have a choice. She just has to keep it. But it triples in value, and then she has to make an offer back to you. And then whatever she makes offer back to you triples in value, and then you make an offer back to her, and you both know the rules of the game, and we're going to do this 10 times. Now what do? Right? So you get this sort of prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. Well, let's see. That could be a lot of money, so I'm going to start off fairly generous, and then he'll be generous back, and we'll go back and forth. But wait, let's see, there's 10 rounds, and he might defect on the 9th and keep all the money, so I better defect on the 8th. But wait, if he's thinking like me, he might defect on the 7th. And you get this sort of really interesting sort of psychological thing that's going on there. Well, what Zach simply wanted to know is if this oxytocin business is true, there maybe is a blood flow change in this. And so sure enough, he actually draws blood of subjects playing these different kind of game theory games, in which those who are cooperating, making generous offers, 50-50, 60-40, or in other models where you actually make a donation to somebody, like they give you actual real cash to subjects who can make a donation to a real charity in Southern California there, and they actually make, Those that made more generous offers have an increase in oxytocin. They have more generosity. So then he wanted to know, well, what's the cause and what's the effect? So to test that, he gave, in a similar scenario, one group of subjects a hit of oxytocin. You do it through a nose spray. This is like for inducing labor in pregnant women, you give them a nose spray with oxytocin, and it goes right across the blood-brain barrier, boom, right into the brain. They get a nice little boost of this, and it does more than just cause you to go into labor because you're not pregnant that way. But it does this other thing. It causes subjects to be much more generous, by 2 to 3 times more generous in their offers to charities, for example, or the cooperativeness, generosity, and so on. So there's something going on here that's deeply embedded, because we know from yet another line of inquiry. You have the behavioral research, you have the neuro research, and then in primates you can track this. That is, Franz de Waal's research, Sarah Brosnan's research, and several other primatologists around the country run these sort of behavioral economic games with chimpanzees and with capuchin monkeys. Chimpanzees, last common ancestor 6 to 7 million years ago. Capuchin monkeys, last common ancestor maybe 12, 14 million years ago. So picture the scenario. 2 chimps are in 2 cages here, and they haven't eaten in a while, so they're poor starving students. They're hungry and motivated. And below them is a platform in which, if you pull the 2 ropes up, on the platform is a bucket of fruit that they really like. Over on one side. So if one of them doesn't, the platform goes up and the bucket pops, and neither of them gets a payoff. If they both cooperate properly and pull it up, the platform comes up and one of them gets the fruit. The question is, what does the one do with the fruit? If he just selfishly eats it, then the system breaks down fairly quickly and the other one refuses to cooperate the next round or the round after that. If there's some sharing of the reward, that is, if there's an exchange, then the other chimp is more likely to cooperate in the next round. In other words, they're acting like traders in a social system, an economy. And now this has even been seen in capuchin monkeys, whose brains are really small. I mean, they're really not doing any calculating at all. They're just having a sense of right and wrong. And when there is a defection, by the way, they show great distress. I mean, they're upset, they refuse to cooperate, they throw things. They clearly see, wait, this is not fair. That bastard is getting away with this. And then finally, this research has been replicated by Colin Kammerer from Caltech on Western cultures around the world, and especially the freedom to trade. So in other words, you need what we would call a liberal democracy and a relatively free market economy. So that's the position I'm sort of defending here. And the spread of that in more places to more people is better. So, in conclusion, just sort of wrapping up the last 2 passages that I'll read, then we'll take questions. The psychology behind diffusing intergroup aggression involves turning potentially dangerous total strangers into prospectively helpful honorary friends. This process is enable and enforce positive social interactions that lead to trust. One of the most powerful of these forms of interactions is trade, the effects of which I wish to elevate into a principle based on an observation by the 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat. Where goods do not cross frontiers, armies will. Bastiat's principle not only helps us understand how hunter-gatherers made the transition to consumer traders, it also illuminates one of the primary causes of conflict. Its corollary elucidates one of the principal steps toward conflict resolution. If Bastiat's principle holds that where goods do not cross frontiers, armies will, then its corollary dictates that where goods do cross frontiers, armies will not. Now this is a principle, not a law, since there are exceptions, both historically and today. Trade will not prevent war, but it attenuates its likelihood. Of course, what's the first thing 2 nations do when they don't like each other? There's economic embargoes and trade restrictions and so forth, like we have imposed on North Korea and Cuba and Iran. Thinking in terms of probabilities instead of absolutes, trade between groups increases the probability that peaceful and stable relations will continue and decreases the probability that instabilities and conflicts will erupt. So let's return to where we began the book or the story with the Yanomamo hunter-gatherers and how they evolved into Manhattan consumer traders. When missionaries first began working with the Yanomamo, they discovered that if they provided the native peoples with tools for the procurement and production of food and other resources, the amount of Yanomamo inter-village fighting was greatly reduced. The great Yanomamo ethnographer Napoleon Chagnon originally gave the Yanomamo their fierce people moniker. The book was just called Yanomamo, not fierce people. And he since took that off because, you know, they're not fierce all the time. And it's like they're eating, they're not fierce. They're loving, they're not fierce. Mostly they're just sitting around. Because he discovered that the Yanomamo are sophisticated traders as well as ferocious warriors, because trade creates political alliances. Following the political dictum, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yanomamo inter-village trade and reciprocal food exchanges serve as a powerful social glue in the creation of political alliances. Village A cannot go to Village B and announce that they are worried about being conquered by the more powerful Village C, since that would reveal their own weaknesses. Instead, Village A forms an alliance with Village B through trade and reciprocal feasting. And as a result, they not only gain military protection, but also encourage inter-village peace. As a byproduct of this politically motivated economic exchange, even though each Yanomamo band could produce all the SKUs it needed for survival, they often set up a division of labor and a system of trade. The unintended consequence is an increase in both wealth and SKUs. The Yanomamo trade not because they're innate altruists or nascent capitalists. They trade because they want to form political alliances. Without these frequent contacts with neighbors, Chagnon explains, alliances would be much slower in formation and would be even more unstable once formed. A prerequisite to stable alliance is repetitive visiting and feasting, and the trading mechanism serves to bring about these visits. In other words, where goods cross Yanomamo frontiers, Yanomamo armies do not. And then to sort of push that one more step, just for fun. In the epilogue, you're allowed to kind of be speculative. Anyway, so expanding on Bastiat's principle, I call this the Starbucks corollary to Bastiat's principle. Where Starbucks cross frontiers, armies will not. It is the free trade of products between peoples and open access to services across geographic borders obviates the necessity of political borders and thereby decreases the probabilities that armies will cross them. To the Starbucks corollary, I add the Google theory of peace, where information and knowledge cross frontiers, armies will not. That is, the free trade of information between peoples and the open access to knowledge across geographic borders obviates the necessity of political borders and thereby decreases the probability that armies will cross them. A stern example can be seen in Europe. Since the Treaty of Rome and the formation of the European Union, which integrated disparate and historically divided European nations under one economic umbrella, where once invasions and wars were commonplace throughout 1,000 years of European history, they are now almost unthinkable. Try it. Imagine Germany invading France and waging war upon it. Or picture France motoring its armies through the Channel and marching them into London to declare the country French. What once made for dramatic literature now sounds like Pulp Fiction. The wickification of the economy, Wickonomics, as it is becoming known, adds to the Google theory of peace the entire world economy as practiced by and participated in by billions of people. And Wikipedia is the right analog for this emerging economic phenomenon. It is the collaboratively created encyclopedia that runs on wiki software that allows real-time and constant editing of documents by anyone, anywhere, anytime. It is an open-source, peer-produced, mass-collaborated, bottom-up, self-organized, emergent property of millions of people choosing to build the modern equivalent of the Alexandrian Library, whose purpose it was to make the sum of the world's knowledge available to everyone in one location. Granted, the Alexandrian Greeks had far less knowledge to store than we do today by many orders of magnitude, but we have the World Wide Web. In the long run, no dictator, demagogue, priest, president, or any other pretender to power will be able to control the Googleification, Wikification, eBayification, MapQuestification, YouTubeification, MySpaceification of information, knowledge, geography, personal relationships, markets, and the economy. Chinese bureaucrats can attempt to put all the firewalls and controls they want on 1 billion potential Chinese web servers. but they will never be able to prevent knowledge, products, and people from finding their way to those who seek them. Freedom finds a way. Thank you. Okay, so I guess we have the time. Oh, yeah, we're maybe a few minutes for questions.
Well, you seem to be sold on the idea of free trade. But you really think that everything that happens, like the loss of our steel industry, or the loss of so many jobs in the manufacturing sector, one time Philadelphia was a great manufacturing city, now doesn't have any factories. And this happens systematically, and when other companies dump products on our markets, and when other companies run their factories with inadequate attention to worker benefits and poor working conditions, are you sure that free trade is really the answer?
Yes, I'm sure. Next. Yeah, of course, these are legitimate good questions. Well, I mean, it's a multi-faceted question with multiple answers, but I mean, unions are one way of a bottom-up, self-organized way of responding to that, to basically say we're not going to work unless you improve the conditions. Well, the writer's strike in Hollywood is an example right now. There's a long tradition of that. So that's one response to the answer. One of the reasons I think corporations have gotten away with a lot of things that they probably shouldn't have is because they have had too much power over governments and too much influence and special favors and privileges imposed on the people by government and law. And that, the libertarian perspective would say that half the reason those things are happening in the first place is because these companies are taking unfair advantage of the system. And that was Smith's point about we have to be careful that these people can conspire against us, so they shouldn't be getting these special privileges. Now, as for preserving, say, the steel industry in Philadelphia, yeah, okay, but what about the horse and buggy industry in New York? Why should we have preserved that maybe? Because those are good people, and that was a nice industry. Well, but things move on, and that's just the way it goes. I mean, that's what happens over the long haul. Things change, and there's inevitably, I guess, analogous to punctuated equilibrium is Schumpeter's creative destruction. Out of a loose analogy at best, I guess, but out of that, extinction or major events comes new industries, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, first, a brief point that you mentioned Kropotkin. Kropotkin was not entirely forgotten because I read a few years ago that Lynn Margulis said that he was an important influence on her.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
Right.
The other thing, this is not exactly a question, but I'll keep it brief, and it partly perhaps responds to the previous question. I think you're right saying corporations have too much influence, but it's a deeper thing than this. The way I see the economic evolution of the past few centuries is more trade and more democracy become possible through the creation of a public sphere in which allows for transparency. Under feudalism, a lord controlled property entirely. So that was a system in which everything was privately owned, but because everything was privately owned, free movement wasn't possible. Capitalism is possible because we have public roads, public communications, and so on. And what I would suggest is that when the real completion of Adam Smith's revolution, though it goes beyond what he himself probably would have envisioned, would be when all the remaining monopolies on parts of the material world by some people, not only in corporate form, but even individual form, are eliminated, and you have a market based on free movement of human beings between enterprises instead of human beings exercising exclusive control over goods and property. Other people have to beg them or negotiate on uneven terms the conditions of employment, which also allows people to move capital across borders without regard for the communities and their employees.
Yep, I like those points. The first one on transparency is really the key to trust. Transparency is the only way to know for sure. And constantly monitor the possibilities of defection. So think of an economy as just a game with rules, and the rules have to be enforced. I'm comfortable with having all of that happen within a society of law, a rule of law, in which we as a community, through democracy, decide what the rules are. So take carbon trading, for example. As a society, we've decided we want to allow this amount of carbon to be put in the atmosphere every year. Now, you guys can work it out and can trade carbon and whatnot, but but overall, that's the limit we're going to put on it. So, and as long as you have the checks and balances to make sure those rules are enforced, once the rules aren't enforced, the system breaks down. And of course, my last little speech thing there was really the same kind of thing. Any way we can open the borders up and allow people to trade, or communicate, or talk, or anything. That's the wonderful thing about the internet, just where people can't control that. Of course, there's problems with that, sexual predators on MySpace or whatever, but there's new technologies coming up all the time to deal with that. Let's go very in the back.
Yeah, the comment you made about oxytocin, is there any knowledge or theory as to whether that's inborn or to what extent it's inborn versus created? Are there any studies with infants or children in terms of non-response to oxytocin?
Yes, on oxytocin, well, we know that it's far more common in monogamous species than polygamous species. Polygamous, I think it was mole rats, no, it was something else. Anyway, the polygamous species have no oxytocin in monogamous species. It's a bonding. It's an form of attachment. The best book on this, I think, was Helen Fisher's book, Why We Love. And she has a whole series of chapters on the different biochemistry of lust versus love and what happens when you make the transition and how deeply attached. It's not just oxytocin. I didn't talk about dopamine, but dopamine centers in the brain light up. Dopamine's a reward drug. It reinforces basic Skinnerian positive reinforcement in rats, for example. Dopamine's associated with addictive drugs, with watching pornography. The dopamine-rich centers of the brain light up. Anything that sort of feels good or rewards. And then there's a couple others that Helen talks about. And that's why once you fall in love with somebody and you break up, it takes a year and a half to 2 years just for the biochemistry to those neurons to rewire and those chemicals to kind of get out of the system. And that's why it's painful and it takes a while. And, anyway, so that's a good book on that. Here.
I want you to say a little more about Starbucks and Google.
Yes? You want to know if you should buy or sell or what? Those stocks.
I can see that have phenomenal unexpected growth. And I've been in one Starbucks once, didn't like it, never went back. Doesn't matter to me whether I have coffee or not. I'm high on Google. And Google also is impersonal, whereas Starbucks, if you patronize it, is quite personal. There are actually people there. You're actually going to a physical location and patronizing it. Whereas Google, you sit at home on your computer and the world comes to you instead of you going to it. So I see them as quite different.
Well, of course, and I'm just using it metaphorically, although Google is just a tool, whereas Starbucks is an end product. The tool to get you some other product that you want, which is some information or whatever. Actually, I have a whole chapter comparing Enron with Google. In the idea that if most companies were like Enron, the market capitalism would have imploded long ago. They can't be like that. Markets have to be moral. They have to be. Most people, most of the time, are doing good, moral, decent things in business. You only hear about the Enrons because they really do stand out, and they really don't get away with it when they go that far. And so then I have a lengthy discussion of the corporate environment within Enron. And it was very social Darwinism in the old sense of competition and cutthroat and so on. The CEO of Enron, Jeffrey Skilling, said that his favorite book in Harvard Business School was Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. Well, he misread the book. I mean, selfish, yeah, cutthroat, competitive. That's the survival of the fittest. He set up a system in Enron where 10% of all employees had to be fired each year. Have fun, because we're grading on a curve, so no matter what you're doing, somebody's going to get fired. Now, let's go out and have a lot of trust and warmth and team effort here. Well, that's not what happened. Of course, that leads to an immediate breakdown. Transparency's gone. People are horse trading. I'll swap you 2 of my employees for 2 years and this and that. And that's what leads then to these accounting debacles and things where people start hiding stuff. And Google, by contrast, if you've ever been there, it's like a playground. It's like a college campus. They give free food to all their employees. This isn't just altruism. It's a long ways from the local town where you could get lunch or something. So it keeps the employees there on campus. They call it campus. But they give you free breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The food's terrific, free drinks, anything you want. And so, but that's tapping into something else, reciprocal altruism. Before you swipe this Post-it notes or whatever, you've already been tapped into by all this free, nice, wonderful stuff. You're less likely to defect on the rules of how you're supposed to play the game at Google as an employee, that sort of thing. So it's very, very different. Many more companies are like Google than they are Amazon. That's my point. Yes, sir.
It seems from what you were, how you were explaining your models, that they're balanced by bell curve, that things are going to average out, and trading will, there'll be enough good traders to balance out the bad traders, and that we follow natural bell curve. What happens when you get, now we have, with a global economy and global information, people that are excessively powerful and are able to exert an excessive amount of influence and far beyond what they ever were before. What risk does that put to us? Just the Bush administration, and they're putting out their fear campaign, and it's changed the face of international politics.
Yeah, there I think we're back to the transparency problem, right? That's why we have a free press, or at least we hope to expose all that. That's why we have corporate governance is a huge subject in the legal profession. How should we structure the boards of directors so that there's transparency, we know what's going on. I was really actually researching this book, disturbed to find how many big corporation boards have each other on their boards. And there's a little bit of too much insider stuff going on, and it makes me uncomfortable. Not enough transparency. And, but we can try to put more checks and balances on it in the democratic system. Yep.
First is coming back to what you were saying. A friend of yours, a guy I used to work with, whenever he got like a stack of applications, he used to drop half of them because he didn't want to hire enough people. I always thought that was very funny. But I was wondering, what do you see then a future for the nature of the nation state as we've known it the last 300 years with this global economy?
Yeah, well, I think predictions are hard to make, especially about the future, right? Another Yogi Berra is that he never said. So I don't know, but the idea of breaking down those borders is to me a good thing. I'm in favor of globalization, and the nation states are just a bigger tribe, is all. So I guess in the long run, the more we can expand the circle to include everybody as a member of the in-group, then the better. And in the long run, I think it is encouraging. Take, say, instead of the last 10 years or 50 years, say the last 500 years, things are really much better, way better than they were in the Middle Ages or even the early modern period. More people in more places have more freedoms and liberties than ever before, thanks to the spread of liberal democracy and free market economics, and slavery is largely gone now. More and more people have the right to vote and so on. I think in the long run we're moving that way. I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. You have to fight for it and push for it because, again, we're naturally tribal and people want to suck power to themselves and will do what they can to do that. So you have to fight for that. Jefferson said, yes.
Since the advent of agriculture, it's been noted that our physical bodies have evolved with thinner and smaller teeth, a receding jaw. Have you, in your research, ever come across anything where, since the advent of the speeding up of culture and technology, where we have our brains or our emotional responses have evolved? Do you have any documentation on that?
No. But I think there's stuff coming that could change that, such as machine-human interface article in the New York Times science section today about this monkey that had electrodes implanted in it that controlled the movements of a robot in Japan. The monkeys here in America, the robots in Japan, they're yoked through the internet in real time. And so the monkey is trained to think. The monkey's on a treadmill and he's running. and the electrodes are measuring that. And then they train him to, they train, well, I guess the big step was they have a video of the robot. So he starts running, and then the robot starts running. And the electrodes, the neurons in his brain are firing, sending the signal through the electrodes all the way through the internet to Japan, and that causes the robot to start running. And then they shut off the treadmill that the monkey's running on, and the robot keeps running. So the monkey is still thinking about running, and just the thinking about the running, his legs, makes the robot's legs move. Whoa, that's really cool, right? So I mean, this whole idea, here's a great example of the paranormal becoming the normal, right? I mean, you just think a thought and something, the robot moves. Whoa, that's telekinesis. Well, no, actually, if you know about the chip in the brain, it's not telekinesis, right? So, I mean, I think those are the sorts of things we're likely to see rather than differential reproductive success of humans being selected for by, because our society's mores say we should keep everybody alive if we can. We don't have a lot of differential reproductive success in natural selection. Let's go there in the red.
A number of times throughout the talk tonight, you mentioned your studies, investigations that really probe very deep and precise around not only the human brain, but as you demonstrated, the monkey brain. With the proliferation of really inexpensive cameras coupled with really sophisticated software, do you think, just bring in a religious thing, all things committed in knowledge or ignorance, do you think that there's the effects on human population and our behavior, our socialized, the ability to detect either lying or systematic fraud, these kinds of cameras in public places or private spaces or storage and not allowed. I can't help but feel there's almost a big brother happening. What happens when that stuff comes out of the lab and it comes into the general populace?
Yeah, well, we have to be cautious about that. Wasn't there a Philip K. Dick book about that Tom Cruise did the movie? Yeah, what was it? Yeah, the Minority Report, right, where you know that criminals are going to do this ahead of time. It is still pretty science fiction. I think probably worship maybe. I mean, the paranormal, I don't want to know what other people are thinking about me. Definitely I don't want to know, because it's probably not good, or it's probably, anyway, I just don't. And I don't want people to know what I'm thinking, so I think we will naturally have restrictions on that, the use of that kind of technology. Let's do one more question here. I can hear it.
And analyzing the way that economic systems and more so theologies expand, I think it's pertinent to look at history. As we look back to say the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where actually just last week there was a declassification by the NSA, the Federation of American Scientists made a FOIA request that shows that there was deliberate falsification and skewing of intelligence to get us involved in that war. Isn't it shocking? Yeah, right. I know it seems to be the norm now that governments and actually our own domestic government has used falsification of intelligence to get us into war. I find your research on the 9/11 conspiracy theories to be of special interest then, because a lot of people have legitimate concerns about what transpired on that day, not necessarily about physics so much, but more about the whistleblowers within our own government who stepped out into the light and said, hey, we had the foreknowledge, we essentially had the wherewithal to avoid those attacks, and yet on the day in question, that all didn't come through as was would be expected. Now, when these whistleblowers try to step out into the light and speak to the 9/11 Commission and get their testimony on record and out to the general public, isn't it then suspect when that testimony and authority is suppressed by some of the highest levels of our own government to then suspect some sort of internal corruption at bare minimum? Okay,
fair enough. A couple things. Well, in fact, we do have the Freedom of Information Act, and that's better than when we didn't have it. So at least we can get that information, and that eventually the free press can use that. And we do have whistleblower laws, okay? So maybe they're not always properly applied, but the whistleblower laws are there. The woman who blew the whistle on Enron, forget her name, Catherine. But anyway, she's protected to be able to do that. Well, that's better than it used to be. That's a new social technology that we added. As for what was actually said and who knew what when, I think what's going on there is the hindsight bias. What's called the hindsight bias. It is in hindsight we recognize what was obviously there. So, for example, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the generals and the admirals and all the way up to Roosevelt were accused of, well, you should have seen this coming. I mean, come on, how could you miss it? And then you scan through the vast data of intelligence reports that were sent to the White House and say, look, there's one, and oh, look, there's one. And of course, they're pointing these out amongst thousands of pieces of intelligence that you only see once the event has already happened. So everybody makes a big deal about Condi Rice's, the August 9th, 2001 memo, Al-Qaeda will attack U.S. soil, on U.S. soil. Wow! It could be more obvious than that on 9/12, yes. But on 9/10, no, because there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of pieces of intel that say they're going to do this, they're going to do that, this base, that embassy, who knows, this, that, and the other. Nobody thought of planes into a building. You know, it's pretty clever, creative. So in hindsight, yes, of course, you can see that. So I don't think they're telling us anything in a fair way. That before the fact, it's hardly fair to hold those people accountable for something that none of us saw. Nobody saw.
If I may, real fast. Just post 9/11, you had, for example, FBI translator Sibel Edmonds, who tried to speak out, and then she was put under national security gag order. Essentially, her story was indicated that we were infiltrated by Turkish elements and possibly other governments who were involved in the 9/11 plots, and were actually in the Federal Bureau of Investigation after 9/11, covering it up. And when she tried to report that to her direct supervisor, she discovered that he was in on the plot as well. And then once she tried to go above his head, she discovered that Robert Mueller actually threatened her and said basically, if you do not stop your investigation, I'll turn it into an investigation on you.
You're way beyond me because I don't know the specific details of who said what to when and so on. So I can't comment. I don't know. I find that when I investigate these kinds of claims, however, in general, that often those very specific things turn out not to be true when you look at it. That maybe this one is, but like when I dealt with the Holocaust deniers, it's, oh, did you know that this happened and so on, and Churchill, Roosevelt, and so on, and the Auschwitz and the Hitler, and you actually look it up, it's like it's not like that at all. So yeah, I don't know. So anyway,
it's very disingenuous to associate 9/11, conspiracies with Holocaust denial. I feel.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's all right. Anyway, well, thank you, Sally, and thank you, Eric, and thanks for all for coming. And